we hear the expression signs of the times. And that does have some appropriate ring to it to help us to realize the times we're living in. Some have, like the Watchtower, believe that the last days began in 1914. But again, they have no scriptural basis for that. But we understand from Matthew 24 that when the disciples asked, Jesus' disciples asked Jesus for a sign of his coming and of the conclusion of the system of things, Jesus gave them the answer. But we have to understand that when he said such things, when he told them, you will hear wars and reports of wars, and in other words, when you look at the expression he uses there, it shows that they would experience those conditions. And so the last days began in the first century after Jesus went back to heaven and was resurrected therefore. And even Peter showed in Acts 2:17, he used that expression, last days, and Paul did, and also the book of James and Peter, they also used the same expression to describe the time they were living in. Even if you look at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, and critical times hard to deal with, if you read the context, you'll see Paul is showing that they had to deal with those things. He was telling them to turn away from such ones. So one of the prominent features of the last days was preaching the good news of the kingdom. And if we can remember Jesus' parable of the wheat and the weeds, we understand that from that parable, he showed that the wheat and the weeds would grow together until the conclusion of the system of things. Then Armageddon, there would be a harvesting, a reaping. So what that tells us is that from the first century onward, those Jesus planted as wheat, those Christians would be on this earth from the first century on, all the way through the Dark Ages, the Renaissance periods, all the way up into our time period today. So what that means is that they would, to be wheat, they would have to be preaching the message. And so this is a prominent feature of the last days, which helps us to appreciate the last days did not begin in 1914, but they have been going on since the first century, because his disciples would continue to preach the message, which is a prominent feature of the last days. But one of the things we have to understand is that even though Jesus talked about wars, food shortages, earthquakes, increasing lawlessness, and all these type of things, that was not the sign. That was not the sign of his coming. All Jesus was doing, as he said in Matthew 24:25, he was forewarning them of the things they would have to deal with. Things like even false prophets and those who would come about deceiving others. And the destruction of Jerusalem was one of the things they had to deal with. That generation particularly had to deal with it. Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. He was talking about the things that were to happen to that generation in regards to destruction of the temple. And all those things happen in that generation, not some future generation. Because if you look at every time Jesus used the expression, this generation, he used it in reference to the people at his time. And so, but the end would not end, or the last days would not stop once Jerusalem was destroyed, but that was just part of the things that would have to endure during the last days. No, the last days would continue on past that. And the wheat would continue, the prominent feature of the last days, the preaching of the message, all the way through up into our time period. So what we're trying to establish is that the last days have been going on since the first century. But this is not the sign. This is just Jesus forewarning them. As he said, he that endures to the end will be saved. Family members will turn against you, persecutions, all these things were just things, okay, this is what you're going to have to endure. But the actual sign Jesus mentioned in verse 30, that's the only time he used the expression sign in answering their question. And notice it says in Matthew 24, verse 29, it says, immediately after the tribulation, those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in grief, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So notice that. Then they said, then that sign will appear in the heaven. The sign of the Son of Man will appear, and all the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in grief, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. So this is the sign Jesus spoke about. The other things were not the sign. There's a sign, a particular sign that will happen in the sky that will appear. Now, I know the Watchtower used the expression presence instead of coming, but more translations more appropriately use the word coming, because this is an event. This is not some invisible presence. This is a reality that people will be able to see. Not that they will see Jesus, but whatever that sign will be, it will indicate to all the nations it's over with. The end is coming. The nations are beating themselves in lamentation because it's over with. The end is happening. And so whatever that sign will be in the sky, it will signal to everyone that it's the end. Now, it could be a presence of some type. It may sit there for, no one knows. But we know that once that sign happens, it will bring about lamentation, grief to the earth, to the people and inhabitants of the earth, because they realize this end that they've been denying would come is here. And that sign will give them time to beat themselves in lamentation, to be weeping with gnashing of teeth and so forth, and running and hiding the hills. So that sign may just sit there for a while and terrorize people, but it will signal the destruction of the wicked world. As Jesus said, he will send his angels out to uproot everything causing lawlessness and evil and stumbling out of his kingdom, which is the earth. So this is the sign Jesus was speaking about. Now, the Watchtower, they like to look to 1914 and say, well, World War I and World War II and this type of thing. Well, though that's not the sign. Jesus never said that was the sign. The disciples asked the question, but Jesus answered it the way he was going to answer it. And he did not use the word expression sign until verse 30. And that sign, the only sign, is the sign that will appear in that sky. So we've yet to see that sign. We've yet to have a vision, to see that sign in the sky. But once it happens, that will mean it's over with. That all of us taking no note of what Jesus was saying by keeping on the watch, you see, that will bring about lamentation and grief because we did not believe that it would happen. And so when that sign appears, it will give people time to really reflect, and to beat themselves in lamentation, perhaps to reflect that they had messed up. They gave attention to all these deceiving things that were told them and did not believe the words of Jesus, which have never failed. As we can look at what happened to Jerusalem. They have no temple today, do they? Jesus said that would happen. He prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. It happened. And so instead of putting faith in what Jesus said, they put faith in words of men, and therefore they were deceived. No one knows the day or hour. There's no amount of anything the Bible gives you to know how to calculate when the end is going to happen. So anyone that tries to tell you what they know, they're liars already. They're liars. And they will have to give account for that stumbling, as Jesus said, Matthew 12:36. They're going to give account for every improper word they've said. All that talk about when the end's going to come and applying the Bible in an improper way. And then when they're told about it, they don't even want to receive correction for it, showing how arrogant they are. But they don't make any never mind. Once that sign appears, judgment, it will happen. And many will say, well, Lord, Lord, didn't we? He goes, I never knew you. I don't even know who you are. Get away from me, workers of lawlessness. So that's why we can't be assuming on the Bible. We have to make sure of all things, because we don't want to be doing things that we may think are right because our religious leader says it, but it may not be scriptural. It may not be what Jesus has said. So we got to make sure that what's being said is true. We can't have this arrogance, putting our trust in humans and saying, well, we're thinking you're something when you're not, but remaining humble to correction from the scriptures and follow that direction, and that way we won't be deceived, and we will be on the watch right up until that day when that sign appears in the sky.